It all started with Leo. There's this thing about him, about us, that I've never told anyone. Maybe it's because it's too tangled in the knots of what sibling relationship is supposed to be. Or maybe because even thinking about it feels like crossing some invisible line I never meant to approach. Leo is my brother, my partner in crime, my constant through every ridiculous, awkward, and even painful stage of my life. He's 4 years younger, but if you'd seen us as kids, you'd swear we were siblings. We had that kind of bond, the inseparable finish each other's sentences kind. People always teased us about being attached at the hip, but honestly, I never minded. We just fit like pieces of a puzzle. He turned 18 recently, and while birthdays aren't a huge deal for either of us, I wanted to make this one special. He deserved it. It was a milestone after all. And besides, I promised him a night he wouldn't forget for his first official adult birthday. Leo's not the party type. He's not the kind of guy who craves the rush of crowded dance floors or the chaos of neon lights flashing over thumping bass beats. No, Leo prefers quiet places, long walks, and the occasional hole-in-the-wall cafe. So I didn't go overboard. I picked a small bar downtown that had live acoustic music on Fridays, cheap but decent cocktails, and a crowd mellow enough to keep the night laid back. When I dragged him there, he protested the whole way, rolling his eyes and calling me a bad influence. I laughed, joking that it was my duty as the older, wiser sister to corrupt him just a little. He didn't buy it, of course. Leo knows me better than I know myself sometimes. The place was perfect. String lights dangled from the ceiling, casting a warm, golden glow over mismatched furniture and walls covered in indie band posters. The faint scent of pine lingered, probably from the bar's homemade syrup cocktails, and soft chatter filled the space, blending with the hum of the live guitarist strumming in the corner. I ordered us 2 drinks, something sweet and barely alcoholic for him, and something a little stronger for me. I'd been waiting for this moment for months, ever since Leo joked that turning 18 just meant he'd finally get to feel official. To adulthood, I said, raising my glass toward him with a grin. He hesitated for a second, then clinked his glass against mine, his lips curling into a small smile. To letting you boss me around even more, apparently. We sat at a corner table, and the hours slipped by in the way they always did with Leo, effortlessly. We talked about everything and nothing, from our favorite episodes of The Office to whether aliens were real. It felt just like old times, but there was something different too. A weight in the air I couldn't put my finger on. At one point, I caught myself staring at him. His dark hair was a little longer than usual, curling at the ends in a way that made him look older than he was. His eyes, sharp and observant as ever, softened when he laughed at one of my dumb jokes. I couldn't help but notice the way the low bar lighting outlined the curve of his jaw, the way his hands, bigger than I remembered, rested comfortably on the table as he leaned in, engrossed in whatever we were talking about. I'd seen him a million times before, but that night, something shifted. "You're quiet," he said suddenly, snapping me out of whatever daze I'd fallen into. His gaze met mine, curious but gentle, as if he could see right through me. "What's up?" "Nothing," I said quickly, taking a sip of my drink to buy myself a second. "Just thinking. About how weird it is that you're 18 now," I admitted, forcing a laugh. "It feels like just yesterday you were that scrawny little kid who cried when he lost at Mario Kart. Hey, in my defense, you cheated." "I didn't cheat. You were just bad at Rainbow Road." He rolled his eyes, but I saw the hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. For a second, the moment felt lighter again, like the tension I'd imagined had only been in my head. But then his expression softened, and he tilted his head slightly, studying me in that way he always did when he thought I wasn't telling him the whole truth. "Seriously," he said, "what's on your mind?" I wanted to brush it off, to make some sarcastic comment or steer the conversation back to safe ground. But I couldn't. Something about the way he looked at me made my throat tighten, and suddenly, I didn't know what to say. Before I could figure it out, the guitarist started playing a familiar song, a slow, sweet melody that had been one of our favorites back when we were kids. Without thinking, I reached across the table and grabbed his hand. "Come on," I said, pulling him to his feet. "What are you doing?" he asked, laughing nervously. "Dancing," I said. "You're 18 now. Live a little." His protests were half-hearted at best, and before long, we were swaying together in the middle of the small, makeshift dance floor. It wasn't much, just a clumsy shuffle of feet and awkward laughter, but it felt like the world had shrunk down to just the two of us. For a moment, everything else faded away. The noise of the bar, the people around us, even the fact that this was supposed to be just another family night out. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit before. Leo wasn't just my brother. Not anymore. We were laughing so hard that my stomach ached, the kind of laugh that starts deep and uncontrollable, only getting worse the more ridiculous things get. It didn't matter what the joke was anymore. It was just the alcohol, the mood, the way we bounced off each other effortlessly. The shots definitely weren't helping. I'd lost track of how many we'd had, but enough that Leo's face had turned a little red, and his usually shy smile had transformed into something freer, looser, almost boyish. And God, that smile. I remember looking at him, really looking at him, and the thought struck me out of nowhere, sharp and startling like a slap to the face. Damn, he's not a kid anymore. His features had always been familiar, but that night they seemed sharper, more defined. His jawline, the way his hair fell into his eyes, the lines of his shoulders under the plain t-shirt he wore. It was like seeing him for the first time, and yet it wasn't. This was Leo, my Leo. The same person who used to ride his bike to my house and beg me to help him with algebra. The same person who used to pout when I wouldn't let him pick the movie. Except he wasn't the same. The realization sent a weird flutter through my chest, like my body knew something my brain wasn't ready to admit. I shoved the thought down hard, locking it away where it couldn't bother me anymore. This was Leo, my brother. Nothing more. By the time we stumbled back to my apartment, we were both buzzing from alcohol and the adrenaline of the night. My keys jingled as I struggled to unlock the door, and Leo leaned against the wall beside me, his laughter low and warm in my ear. "Need help there, champ?" he teased. "Shut up," I muttered, finally getting the door open. "You're lucky I didn't make you pay for those last 2 rounds." "Yeah, because you're such a responsible adult," he shot back, flashing that infuriatingly charming grin that made my stomach flip. Inside, the apartment felt small and cozy, the warm glow of the kitchen light spilling over the living room. We kicked off our shoes and collapsed onto the floor like a pair of idiots, surrounded by half-empty glasses of water and an unopened bag of chips I'd grabbed on the way home. At some point, Leo leaned back, propped up on his elbows, and let out a content sigh. "This was a good night," he said, his voice softer now, almost thoughtful. "Of course it was," I said, smirking. "I planned it." He laughed, but there was something in his expression that made me pause. A flicker of something unspoken, something that hung in the air between us like a question neither of us dared to ask. "I mean it," he said. "Thanks for this. For everything." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling somewhere deep in my chest. "You don't have to thank me," I said. "You know that, right?" "Yeah," he said, his eyes meeting mine. but I want to. The moment stretched out, heavy and charged, until I broke it with a laugh that sounded way too nervous for my liking. All right, that's enough of the emotional stuff. Time for a game. A game? Yep, I said, crawling over to grab the dusty chessboard I kept stashed under the couch. Prepare to get your ass kicked. I don't know who first suggested the strip chess rules. Maybe it was me, trying to diffuse the weird tension with humor. Or maybe it was Leo, emboldened by the alcohol. Either way, before I knew it, we were sitting cross-legged on the floor, the chess pieces scattered between us, and clothes were coming off piece by piece. Leo was awful at chess, always had been, so it didn't take long for him to loose his socks, his hoodie, and eventually his shirt. I wasn't much better though, and soon we were both down to just our underwear. But somewhere along the way, the game stopped being about chess. I could feel it, the shift in the air, like a current running between us. Every move he made, every glance he shot my way, carried a weight that hadn't been there before. My heart pounded in my chest, louder than the distant hum of the refrigerator or the faint music still playing from my phone. "Your move," he said, his voice low and steady, but his eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, stayed locked on mine. The game didn't matter anymore. I could barely focus on the board in front of me, let alone think about strategy. My brain was too busy spinning, caught somewhere between panic and something I didn't want to name. "Hey," he said after a long pause, breaking the silence. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly, too quickly. His lips curved into a small, almost teasing smile, but there was a flicker of something more behind it. Something softer, more vulnerable. "I'm not a kid anymore, you know," he said, echoing the thought I'd buried earlier. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "I know," I said, my voice. "Hey," he said after a long pause, breaking the silence. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly, too quickly. His lips curved into a small, almost teasing smile, but there was a flicker of something more behind it. Something softer, more vulnerable. "I'm not a kid anymore, you know," he said, echoing the thought I'd buried earlier. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The distance between us felt impossibly small, the kind of space that could be crossed in a heartbeat if one of us dared to move. And then, as if by some unspoken agreement, we both stopped pretending the game mattered. The kiss felt like stepping into a storm. The kind of storm that shakes you to your core, blurring the line between danger and thrill, pulling you in even as you know you should run the other way. I couldn't think. I didn't want to. All I could feel was Leo, his lips on mine, his hands hesitant yet firm as they found their way to my waist. It was like a dam had broken, releasing something we both kept hidden, maybe even from ourselves. His touch wasn't the awkward fumbling I might have expected, but confident, almost instinctive. My heart hammered in my chest, every beat screaming that this was new, terrifying, exhilarating. We were both naked. I felt the warmth of his body in every pore. His movements were rough and fast. It made me shudder. For a moment, the world outside disappeared. There was no couch beneath us, no scattered chess pieces, no flickering lamp overhead. Just him and me, tangled up in this charged, electric moment. The warmth of his body pressed against mine, the way his breath hitched when I ran my fingers through his hair. It was intoxicating. But then came the footsteps. "Leo," I whispered, my voice sharp but barely audible. "Someone's coming." Panic hit us like a cold splash of water. We scrambled, tripping over each other in our haste, to grab the nearest thing for cover. The blanket from the couch ended up wrapped haphazardly around us, just as the door creaked open. And there she was, my mom. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure it would give us away. She stood in the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the frame, her expression soft but curious. "Dinner's ready," she said, her eyes flicking over the room. "Are you two coming, or—" Leo, bless him, didn't even miss a beat. "We already ate out," he mumbled, his voice muffled by the blanket he pulled up to his chin. I added a sleepy-sounding agreement, nodding with what I hoped was convincing nonchalance. For a moment, she just stood there like she was about to ask another question. My entire body tensed, every muscle coiled, waiting for the inevitable follow-up. But then she just smiled, shook her head, and said, "All right. Good night, then." The door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was deafening. Leo and I stared at each other for a beat, wide-eyed and breathless, before bursting into laughter. It was the kind of laughter that comes from sheer relief, bubbling up uncontrollably, spilling out in gasps until tears streamed down my face. "That was close," he said, his voice shaky between chuckles. "Too close," I replied, trying to catch my breath. But as the laughter faded, the tension crept back in, stronger now, like the air between us had been supercharged. His eyes met mine, and I could see it. The same wild, unspoken thing I'd been feeling all night. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Leo leaned in again, slower this time, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from my face. The gentleness of the gesture made my chest ache. Then his lips were on mine, softer now but no less consuming, and I felt myself giving in all over again. The blanket fell away as we moved, the chess pieces scattering further across the floor. It didn't matter. All that mattered was the way his hands traced the curve of my back, the way his voice broke when he whispered my name against my skin. My body arched under the stroking of his strong hands. I was on the verge many times. His smooth movements forced the air out of my lungs. Time lost all meaning. The room seemed to shrink until it was just us, caught in this moment that felt both infinite and fleeting. Every kiss, every touch, every whispered word felt like a revelation. Leo's arm draped lazily over my waist, his breathing slow and steady as I rested my head on his chest. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was full, like the room was alive with everything we hadn't said yet. I traced lazy patterns on his skin, feeling the rise and fall of his chest beneath my fingers. So I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper, "What now?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he shifted, propping himself up on one elbow to look at me. His expression was unreadable, but there was something soft in his eyes, something that made my throat tighten. "Now," he said, his voice steady but low, "we figure it out." I nodded, swallowing hard. It wasn't an answer, not really, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. We stayed like that, the early morning light washing over us, making everything feel a little more real. I didn't know what would happen next, but in that moment, I didn't care. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. A week later, we found ourselves back at the same bar, though this time, everything felt different. The low hum of chatter, the clinking of glasses, the dim lighting, all of it should have been comforting, familiar even. But something had shifted between Leo and me in the days since that night at my place. There was a kind of quiet anticipation between us now, a tension in the air that neither of us could ignore. I kept trying to act like everything was fine, like we could still just hang out and laugh about the same stupid things we always had. But each glance I stole at Leo made it harder to pretend. He looked different to me now, though I couldn't quite pinpoint what had changed. Maybe it was the way his hair fell over his forehead, or the way his lips twitched whenever he smiled. Or maybe it was the way he seemed to gravitate toward me more, his eyes never leaving mine for too long. It was subtle, but it was enough to make my heart race. The bar wasn't crowded, but it felt like the world had narrowed down to just the two of us. We found a booth in the corner, ordering drinks, our fingers brushing briefly as we passed them back and forth. I could feel the electricity between us, buzzing just beneath the surface. We tried to make small talk, laughing about something I barely remember now, but even the sound of our voices felt different. There was this unspoken understanding between us, a weight hanging in the air that neither of us knew how to handle. Leo caught me staring at him at one point, and his expression shifted. Something flickered behind his eyes. For a second, I thought I saw the same look in him that I was feeling inside, but it was gone before I could be sure. He cleared his throat, and I quickly looked away, trying to pretend like I hadn't been caught. But I knew he felt it too. I could see it in the way he kept glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking. I took a long sip from my drink, trying to steady my nerves, but the alcohol only seemed to make things worse. It was like the buzz in my veins made everything sharper, clearer, the tension between us more unbearable. We were both tipsy by then, but neither of us had drunk enough to dull the electricity running between us. We didn't speak for a moment, and in that silence, everything seemed to come to a head. I stood up abruptly. I don't know why. Maybe it was the quiet desperation in the pit of my stomach, the way my heart was hammering in my chest, urging me to do something, anything, to break the silence. "I need to use the bathroom," I muttered, more to myself than to him. Leo blinked, clearly a little startled, but he nodded, watching me as I walked toward the back of the bar. My steps felt unsteady, like I was walking on air, and my mind was a storm of confusion. What the hell was I doing? Why was everything so complicated now? I pushed through the bathroom door, and for a second, I stood there, staring at myself in the mirror, trying to calm my racing heart. I wasn't sure what I expected to happen. I had no idea how I'd gotten here, how we'd gone from childhood siblings to something that felt dangerous. But then the door opened behind me, and I didn't have time to think. Leo stepped inside, his gaze locked on mine with that same look I couldn't quite decipher. His breath was heavy, his body tense with something I couldn't put my finger on. I froze. My pulse thudded in my ears. The air between us seemed to thicken, and it felt like time had stopped. Without a word, Leo closed the distance between us. His hand brushed against mine, a gentle, hesitant touch at first, like he was asking for permission. My breath caught, and before I knew it, I was stepping closer to him, my hand reaching out to rest on his chest, feeling the warmth of his skin through the fabric of his shirt. And then, just like that, he kissed me. It wasn't soft, it wasn't gentle. It was frantic and wild, and completely out of control. But it was exactly what I needed in that moment. I could feel his urgency, the heat of his body pressed against mine, and my mind went completely blank. There were no thoughts, no hesitation, just the need to feel him, to taste him, to know if this was real. His lips were warm and demanding, and I kissed him back just as fiercely. My hands found his shoulders, then his neck, pulling him closer until I could feel the thrum of his heartbeat against mine. The kiss was messy, urgent, but it was perfect. It was everything I had been holding back, everything I hadn't known I needed. I didn't know how long we stood there, locked in each other's arms, but eventually, reality slammed into us both. We broke apart, breathless, eyes wide with shock, but neither of us could look away. The silence between us was thick with the weight of what we had just done. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, catching our breath, trying to make sense of everything. And then, just as quickly as it had started, we were scrambling to gather ourselves together. Leo stepped back, looking at me with wide, uncertain eyes. He wiped his mouth, as if trying to erase the evidence of what had just happened. And for a split second, I felt a pang of regret. What if I had ruined everything? What if I had pushed him too far? But before I could say anything, Leo grabbed my hand, and without a word, he pulled me toward the door. We slipped out of the bathroom like we were in a movie, our hearts pounding, trying to act casual as we rejoined the crowd at the bar. I could feel the heat of his hand in mine, the tension still hanging between us, but we didn't speak about it. We couldn't. Not yet. We ordered more drinks, though neither of us had any real interest in them anymore. The bar felt suffocating now, like the noise and the people were closing in on us. I kept glancing at Leo, catching him looking at me with that same unreadable expression, and I knew we both knew it wasn't over. That kiss had changed everything. It didn't take long before we found ourselves back outside, slipping into a taxi, the quiet of the night wrapping around us like a cocoon. The ride was a blur. I couldn't focus on anything but the feel of Leo sitting next to me, the heat of his body, the way he kept stealing glances at me out of the corner of his eye. When we finally reached my place, we didn't say anything. We didn't need to. We both knew what would happen next. We stumbled into the living room, a mess of limbs and tangled emotions. Leo sat down first, pulling me into his lap, and this time there was no hesitation. There was no time to doubt or question what we were doing. We kissed again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if we were trying to savor the moment, to make it last. We fell asleep together, tangled in each other's arms, the weight of everything hanging between us. But in that moment, it didn't matter. It was just us, wrapped up in the softness of the blankets and the warmth of our bodies. The world outside could wait. We had all the time we needed. But I knew, deep down, that things were never going to be the same. That kiss had changed everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering what it all meant. Was this something more? I couldn't stop thinking about the way his lips felt against mine, the way his hands held me like I was something worth keeping. Everything felt so new, but at the same time, it felt like I was falling into something familiar, like it had been waiting for me all along. I was so deep in my thoughts, I didn't even hear him come into my room. Suddenly, I felt the bed dip beside me, and before I knew it, he was there, sliding into bed and wrapping his arms around me. I tensed at first, my thoughts still racing, but his touch was so warm, so comforting, that I couldn't help but melt into him. He kissed me, soft and slow, his lips lingering for a moment longer than usual. When he pulled back just enough to whisper, I couldn't stay away. It was like my heart had stopped and then started racing all over again. I didn't say anything. Words felt unnecessary in that moment. He didn't need to explain, and I did. It wasn't soft, it wasn't gentle. It was frantic and wild and completely out of control. But it was exactly what I needed in that moment. I could feel his urgency, the heat of his body pressed against mine, and my mind went completely blank. For the next 5 hours, we just held each other, kissing and talking about nothing and everything. It was like the whole world disappeared, and all that mattered was us. The outside noise, the expectations, the confusion, it all melted away in the warmth of his arms. We didn't need to talk about the kiss, didn't need to overanalyze the past few days. It was enough to simply be together, to let everything else fade into the background. I could hear the sound of his breath, steady and calm, and it somehow made everything feel right. I asked him about the little things, how his day had gone, what he was thinking about when he came to my room. He asked me the same, but we both knew the real question was unspoken. What did this mean for us? Where did we go from here? But the answers didn't come right away, and that was okay. In that moment, there was no pressure to have it all figured out. He kissed me again, this time slower, like he was savoring every second. I kissed him back with the same intensity, my fingers tracing the lines of his face, memorizing every detail. It was as if time had stopped for us, like the world outside our little bubble didn't exist. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to rush to the next thing. I could just exist in the present with him. At some point, we stopped talking altogether, letting the silence between us speak for itself. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and I realized that I had never felt this kind of connection with anyone before. It was deep, almost overwhelming, but in the best way possible. There were no games between us now, no second guessing. There was only honesty, only the rawness of two people who had finally let go of the walls they'd been building for so long. I don't know when we fell asleep. It wasn't like any sleep I'd had before. It wasn't peaceful, exactly. It was more like a moment of perfect surrender, where the weight of everything was finally allowed to rest. When I woke up, the sunlight was filtering through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. Leo was still beside me, his arm draped over my waist, holding me close like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. I smiled softly, feeling the warmth of his presence seep into my skin. I should have been worried about what this meant, about what was coming next, but I wasn't. For the first time in a long time, I was just okay. I reached out to touch his hand, tracing the lines of his fingers, and I couldn't help but wonder if this was it. Was this where we were supposed to be? Were we still just two people who happened to fall into each other's lives at the right time? Or had we crossed that line? Was this sibling relationship or something more? The truth was, I didn't know. But what I did know was that I wasn't ready to walk away from this, from him. Not yet. He stirred beside me, his eyes fluttering open, and when he saw me looking at him, a small smile played at the corners of his lips. There was no awkwardness, no shame, just an understanding. He didn't need to ask if I was okay, because we both knew the answer. We were both figuring this out, but we were doing it together. We stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other, knowing that the world would eventually come crashing back in. But for now, it didn't matter. For now, it was just us in this quiet space we had carved out for ourselves. I wasn't thinking about what would happen tomorrow or the day after. I wasn't worrying about what anyone else would say or think. I was just here in this moment with Leo. And maybe that's the beauty of it. Sometimes you don't need to know what comes next. Sometimes you just need to be present to let the connection speak for itself. So yeah, that's my story. It's not perfect, and it's definitely not what I expected, but it's real. And honestly, I wouldn't change a thing. Because in that moment, with him beside me, I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be.